February 19, 1945. Dawn broke over the volcanic shores of Iwo Jima as landing crafts approached the beach. The air tasted of salt and diesel as Private First Class Raymond Goodson checked his radio for the 8th time that hour, certain it would function perfectly when the moment came. The men of the 5th Marine Division believed this would be just another stepping stone toward Tokyo, a brief but necessary battle lasting no more than 5 days. They could not have known that this tiny island would become one of the most brutal battlegrounds in the Pacific theater, nor that the fate of thousands would soon rest on a single radioman's desperate gamble. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how one man's unconventional 30-second transmission defied military protocol and conventional wisdom, ultimately saving over 10,000 American lives in one of World War II's bloodiest battles. The morning sky above Iwo Jima was oddly peaceful as Operation Detachment began. From the deck of the USS Mount McKinley, Lieutenant General Holland Smith observed the preliminary bombardment through binoculars. Shell after shell hammered the 8-square-mile volcanic island, churning black sand into enormous plumes that obscured much of the landscape. Intelligence reports had assured command that the intense naval bombardment would neutralize most Japanese resistance. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, had been allocated just 3 days of pre-invasion bombardment rather than the 10 he had requested. The High Command was confident this would be sufficient. "The Japs won't be able to lift their heads for a week after we're through with them," remarked Admiral Richmond Turner, standing beside Smith on the command ship. His voice carried absolute certainty. Lieutenant General Smith, a 40-year veteran known as Howlin' Mad for his temper and demanding standards, nodded silently. Having overseen amphibious operations at Tarawa, Saipan and Tinian, something about this confidence troubled him deeply. He had pushed for more preliminary bombardment, but higher headquarters was eager to maintain their timetable for the eventual invasion of Japan. At precisely 8:30 in the morning, the first wave of Marines from the 4th and 5th Divisions hit the beaches. Private First Class Raymond Goodson, a 22-year-old radioman from Columbus, Ohio, clutched his SCR-300 radio as his landing craft approached the shore. Only 18 months earlier, he had been studying electrical engineering at Ohio State University before the draft notice arrived in his family's mailbox. "Keep that radio dry at all costs, Goodson," Lieutenant Wallace Bradshaw shouted over the thunderous naval bombardment. "You're our lifeline." Goodson nodded, his throat too dry to respond. The radio weighed 35 pounds, and with his other gear, he carried nearly 70 pounds of equipment. His job was to maintain contact between their company and battalion command, relaying coordinates, situation reports, and requests for support. The landing craft hit the beach with a jarring thud. The ramp dropped, and Marines poured out onto the black volcanic sand. Goodson followed closely behind Lieutenant Bradshaw, struggling to find footing as his boots sank into the soft terrain. The beach appeared eerily quiet. "Move inland! Push forward!" shouted Sergeant Frank Kowalski, waving men toward their objective. The peculiar nature of Iwo Jima's geography became immediately apparent. The volcanic sand made movement exhausting, with each step requiring twice the normal effort. Men sank ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, their progress slowing to a frustrating crawl. Goodson struggled to keep up while protecting his radio. Captain James Dennison, commanding Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, conferred with his radioman while studying his map. "Relay to battalion that we've made landfall and are proceeding to checkpoint Alpha. Minimal resistance so far." For the first 40 minutes, the landing proceeded with surprising ease. Too easy, thought Sergeant Kowalski, a veteran of 3 previous amphibious landings. Experience had taught him that when things seemed too good to be true, they usually were. At precisely 9:10 in the morning, the entire landscape of Iwo Jima erupted. Hidden artillery positions, bunkers and pillboxes that had weathered the preliminary bombardment unleashed a coordinated barrage of devastating fire. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had forbidden his men from firing during the initial landing, waiting instead for the beaches to fill with American troops. "Take cover!" screamed Lieutenant Bradshaw as shells exploded all around them. Marines dove into shell craters or pressed themselves against the minimal protection of the rising terrain. Goodson followed the lieutenant, sliding into a shallow depression in the black sand. Across the island, the carefully planned Japanese defense was revealing itself. Unlike previous battles where Japanese forces had defended at the water's edge, General Kuribayashi had created an intricate network of underground tunnels, connecting over 500 concrete bunkers and artillery positions. The entire mountain of Suribachi had been transformed into a fortress with multiple levels of defenses. 11,000 Japanese defenders were not on the beach, but dug deep into the island itself. Back aboard the USS Mount McKinley, General Smith watched with growing alarm as reports flooded in of heavy casualties and stalled advances. His fears had been realized. The preliminary bombardment had barely scratched the Japanese defenses. "We need to get those men moving off the beach," Admiral Turner ordered. "They're sitting ducks." The casualties mounted rapidly. By midday, the entire beachhead was in chaos. Landing crafts bringing additional troops and supplies were being hit before they could reach shore. The black sand that had hindered movement now became a lethal trap, as Marines couldn't dig proper foxholes in the loose volcanic material. Private First Class Goodson maintained radio contact with battalion headquarters, relaying increasingly desperate requests for naval gunfire support. His company commander, Captain Dennison, had been wounded by shrapnel, leaving Lieutenant Bradshaw in command. "Tell them we're pinned down at grid coordinate Baker 6, Bradshaw shouted to Goodson. "Heavy machine gun fire from bunker complex 200 yards inland. We can't advance without support." Goodson transmitted the message, his hands shaking as he operated the radio dials. All around him, Marines were being cut down by precisely aimed Japanese fire. Medical corpsmen darted between casualties, dragging the wounded to whatever minimal shelter they could find. By late afternoon, the situation had grown desperate. The 5th Marine Division had advanced less than 400 yards from the beach in most sectors. The planned Day 1 objectives remained far out of reach. The casualties were already approaching 3,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, a forward artillery observer, crawled to Goodson's position. His face was streaked with black sand and blood from a minor shrapnel wound. "Your lieutenant hit?" he asked, noticing Lieutenant Bradshaw lying motionless nearby. "Yes, sir. Caught some shrapnel about 20 minutes ago," Goodson replied. "Corpsman says he'll live, but he's out of action." Donnelly nodded grimly. "Who's in command of your platoon now?" Goodson looked around at the scattered Marines in their vicinity. Most of the non-commissioned officers were either casualties or separated in the chaos. "I guess that would be Corporal Henderson, sir, but I haven't seen him since we moved off the beach." Donnelly checked his map. "Listen, kid, I need your radio. Our observer team lost ours when a shell hit our position. I've got coordinates for that bunker complex that's tearing us up." For the next hour, Goodson worked with Sergeant Donnelly, relaying fire coordinates to the ships offshore. The naval gunfire would momentarily suppress the Japanese positions, allowing small groups of Marines to advance a few yards before being pinned down again. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the minute. As dusk approached, the surviving company commanders received orders to consolidate their positions and prepare for a night defense. The ambitious Day 1 objectives had been abandoned. Now the priority was simply to hold what little ground they had gained and prevent a Japanese counterattack from pushing them back into the sea. Overnight, the Japanese launched several infiltration attacks, sending small groups of soldiers with explosives to probe the American lines. Goodson remained awake at his radio, maintaining the communication link that was increasingly vital as units became isolated and fragmented. Dawn on February 20th brought little relief. The Marines resumed their advance, gaining ground measured in yards rather than miles. Each bunker had to be individually neutralized, often at terrible cost. Flamethrower teams would move forward under covering fire to burn out the concrete emplacements, only to discover they were connected to others via the elaborate tunnel system. By the third day of battle, the strategic picture was becoming clear to the command staff. This would not be a quick operation. Admiral Chester Nimitz's intelligence staff had dramatically underestimated both the strength and sophistication of the Japanese defenses. What had been planned as a 5-day operation would clearly take weeks. On February 23rd, a small patrol from Easy Company 2nd Battalion 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi, raising an American flag that would later be replaced in the iconic photograph that came to symbolize the battle. Yet even this symbolic victory did little to improve the tactical situation across the rest of the island. The northern sectors remained heavily contested, with Japanese forces fighting from prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. Marine casualties continued to mount at an alarming rate. By the end of the first week, over 5,000 Americans had been killed or wounded. Private First Class Goodson had been reassigned to serve as a radioman for Major Robert Simmons, the operations officer for 2nd Battalion 28th Marines. His previous experience and demonstrated reliability under fire had earned him this position of increased responsibility. "Goodson, I need accurate reports from our forward companies," Major Simmons instructed. "Our entire fire support plan depends on knowing exactly where our lines are." "Yes, sir," Goodson replied, adjusting his radio settings. The Major studied his map overlay, which was covered with pencil markings showing known Japanese strongpoints and the current Marine positions. 5th Division is taking a beating in the northern sector. They're running into these fortified ridges that intelligence never identified. On the morning of February 26th, 1 week into the battle, Major Simmons received orders for a coordinated push against a heavily defended area designated as Meat Grinder Ridge. Multiple battalions would participate in the assault, supported by tanks, artillery, and naval gunfire. "This is a major operation, Goodson," the Major explained. "Division wants to break through their main line of resistance. If we succeed, we might finally gain some momentum." Throughout the day, Goodson maintained communication with the forward companies as they attempted to advance. The results were discouraging. Tank after tank was disabled by mines or anti-tank weapons. Marine infantry units suffered heavy casualties trying to cross open ground between ridgelines. By late afternoon, it was clear the attack had failed to achieve its objectives. Major Simmons was called to a planning meeting at regimental headquarters, leaving Goodson to monitor the radio net. A call came in from Captain Lewis Hayworth, commanding Baker Company on the front lines. "Base plate, this is Baker 6. We're in serious trouble. Request immediate artillery support at grid coordinates TER 745901, Japanese preparing major counterattack. Over." Goodson acknowledged the transmission and relayed the fire mission request to the artillery liaison officer. Within minutes, American shells were falling on the designated coordinates, temporarily disrupting the Japanese assembly. As night fell, reports indicated Japanese troops were massing for a major counterattack against the 5th Marine Division's lines. Intelligence had intercepted radio transmissions, suggesting this would be no ordinary infiltration attempt, but a coordinated assault aimed at splitting the American beachhead. At division headquarters, a tense meeting was underway. Major General Keller Rocky, commanding the 5th Marine Division, reviewed the latest intelligence with his staff. "They're going to hit us with everything they've got," Colonel Thomas Warnham, the Division Chief of Staff, observed, "and our lines are stretched thin." "We'll have to pull reserves from the 27th and 28th Regiments," General Rocky decided. "Get those orders out immediately." Back at the 2nd Battalion command post, Major Simmons returned with new instructions. "We're shifting to defensive posture, Goodson. The Japs are planning something big for tonight." Throughout the night, sporadic firefights erupted along the front. Japanese infiltrators probed for weaknesses in the American lines. Flares illuminated the battlefield at irregular intervals, casting eerie shadows across the blasted landscape. Shortly after midnight, the main Japanese attack began. Thousands of soldiers emerged from their underground positions, launching a coordinated assault against the center of the 5th Marine Division's line. Frantic calls flooded the radio network. "They're coming through Sector 4. Need reinforcements at Hill 382. Baker Company being overrun." Major Simmons worked feverishly, coordinating artillery support and shifting reserve platoons to threatened sectors. Goodson operated the radio continuously, his voice growing hoarse from repeating messages and confirmations. By 3 in the morning, the situation had reached a crisis point. Japanese forces had penetrated the American lines in several places, threatening to cut off forward Marine units from their support elements. If the breakthrough succeeded, thousands of Marines would be isolated and vulnerable to destruction in detail. Colonel Johnson, the regimental commander, arrived at the battalion command post, his face grim. "Simmons, we need to coordinate a counterattack at first light. If we don't seal these penetrations by dawn, we could lose half the division." The colonel bent over the map, studying the tactical situation. "Our problem is that we don't have an accurate picture of where our forward units are. With all the confusion, we risk hitting our own men with supporting fire." Major Simmons nodded in agreement. "Sir, what about the spotters in the rear observation posts? Could they help coordinate?" "Most of them have lost contact with their forward units," the colonel replied. "We need someone who can get a direct visual on the Japanese assembly areas without being spotted." Private First Class Goodson had been listening to this exchange while maintaining radio contact with the scattered Marine units. An idea began forming in his mind. Unconventional, risky, but potentially decisive. "Sir," he said, addressing the colonel directly, "I think I might have a solution." Colonel Johnson looked up, surprised at being addressed by a private. "What is it, son?" "The Japanese have been jamming our radio frequencies intermittently throughout the battle," Goodson explained, "but they've been using a predictable pattern. They jam for 3 minutes, then switch frequencies for about 30 seconds before jamming again." Major Simmons frowned. "What are you suggesting, Goodson?" "Sir, during those 30-second windows, I believe I could transmit on their command frequency. Based on the signal patterns I've been monitoring, I think I can identify which frequency they're using to coordinate this attack." The colonel and major exchanged glances. What Goodson was suggesting was unprecedented, using the enemy's own communication channel against them. "Even if you could access their frequency," Colonel Johnson said, "what good would it do? They wouldn't listen to an American voice." "No, sir," Goodson agreed, "but I wouldn't be speaking, I'd be transmitting a recording." He explained further. During his time at Ohio State studying electrical engineering, he had experimented with recording and playing back radio transmissions. His SCR-300 radio had been modified with a small wire recorder he had salvaged from damaged equipment, a modification technically against regulations, but one he had maintained for documenting important transmissions. "Last week, I accidentally recorded a Japanese transmission when they briefly used one of our frequencies," Goodson continued. "It was an officer giving withdrawal orders. If I transmit that recording on their command frequency during their next coordinated assault, it might create enough confusion to disrupt their attack." Colonel Johnson looked skeptical. "That's insane, Private. Even if it worked, they'd realize the deception within minutes." "Yes, sir," Goodson acknowledged, "but minutes might be all we need to regroup and bring artillery to bear on their assembly areas." After brief consideration, the colonel made his decision. "Do it. We've got nothing to lose at this point." For the next hour, Goodson worked with the battalion intelligence officer, Lieutenant Philip Garrison, who had some knowledge of Japanese. Though not fluent, Garrison confirmed that the recorded message appeared to be ordering a tactical withdrawal to regroup. At 4:30 in the morning, reports indicated Japanese forces were massing for their final push, a coordinated assault that would hit the weakened American center with potentially devastating effect. "They're moving into position," Major Simmons reported, reviewing the latest information from forward observers. "Estimated 2,000+ troops committed to this attack." Colonel Johnson turned to Goodson. "It's now or never, son. Make it count." Goodson calibrated his radio to what he believed was the Japanese command frequency. The pre-dawn darkness was punctuated by flares and the distant crackle of small arms fire. He waited, watching the second hand on his watch, monitoring the jamming pattern. 30 seconds until their next communication window," he announced. The tension in the command post was palpable. This unorthodox tactic violated every protocol of radio operation, but conventional approaches had failed to stem the Japanese advance. "Now," Goodson said, pressing the playback button and holding his microphone to the recorder speaker. The Japanese voice crackled through the transmission, the recorded message repeating twice within the 30-second window. The quality was poor, distorted by static, and the limitations of the recording device, but the voice was clear enough to be recognizable as a Japanese officer. "Transmission complete," Goodson reported, switching back to the American frequency. "Now we wait." The effect was not immediately apparent. For several minutes, the situation reports from forward marine positions continued to indicate Japanese troops moving into assault positions. Then, at 4:45, the first confused reports began coming in. "Something's happening out there," reported a forward observer. "The Jap units are milling around. Looks like they're arguing with each other." More reports followed. Japanese officers were seen gesturing animatedly, apparently in disagreement. Some units began pulling back while others continued to advance, creating gaps and confusion in their formation. Colonel Johnson seized the opportunity. "Order immediate artillery fire on these coordinates," he commanded, marking several locations on the map where Japanese forces were now exposed and disorganized. Within minutes, American artillery rained down on the confused Japanese units. The carefully planned counterattack had dissolved into chaos. Some Japanese soldiers retreated to their fortified positions, while others continued the attack in uncoordinated, piecemeal fashion that made them vulnerable to the concentrated American firepower. By dawn, the immediate crisis had passed. The Japanese breakthrough had been contained, their momentum broken. The 5th Marine Division's lines, though battered, remained intact. During the debriefing later that morning, General Rocky himself came to the 2nd Battalion command post to understand what had happened. "Your Radioman's initiative saved thousands of lives last night," Colonel Johnson explained to the general. "It was unconventional and against protocol, but it worked." Private First Class Goodson was called in to explain his actions to the general personally. He stood at attention, exhausted after 36 hours without sleep. "At ease, Private," General Rocky said. "Colonel Johnson tells me you found a rather creative solution to our problem last night." "I just applied what I knew about radio systems, sir," Goodson replied modestly. "The Japanese have predictable communication patterns. It seemed worth trying." The general studied the young radio man thoughtfully. "Do you realize what you accomplished? Intelligence estimates that over 10,000 of our men would have been at risk if that Japanese attack had succeeded in splitting our lines. Your 30 seconds of ingenuity may have saved the entire operation." The battle for Iwo Jima continued for another month. The island was not declared secure until March 26, 1945. After 36 days of brutal combat, American casualties totaled nearly 28,000, killed and wounded, including almost 7,000 dead. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest fought to the death or committed suicide. The strategic value of Iwo Jima proved significant. By the end of the war, over 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on the island, saving the lives of over 24,000 airmen who might otherwise have been lost at sea. Private First Class Raymond Goodson received the Silver Star for his actions that night. The citation made no mention of his unorthodox radio tactics. Officially, he was recognized for maintaining critical communications under enemy fire. The true story of how he had momentarily hijacked the Japanese communication network remained classified for decades. After the war, Goodson returned to Ohio State University, completing his degree in electrical engineering. His experiences with military communications led him to a career with the newly formed National Security Agency, where he continued to develop innovative approaches to signals intelligence during the Cold War. In 1962, during a reunion of Iwo Jima veterans, Goodson met Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's former communications officer, Captain Toshio Yoshitake, who had been one of the few senior Japanese officers to surrender rather than commit suicide. Through an interpreter, Yoshitake explained the confusion that Goodson's transmission had caused. "We thought the order came from Imperial headquarters," the former captain revealed. It contradicted General Kuribayashi's explicit instructions, but no one dared question what appeared to be a direct order from Tokyo. By the time we realized it was false, the moment for our coordinated attack had passed. Goodson's story illustrates a truth about warfare that extends beyond tactics and technology. Sometimes the most effective weapons are not those with the greatest destructive power, but those that create confusion and undermine the enemy's confidence in their own plans and leadership. The 30-second radio transmission, technically a violation of protocols and possibly even a breach of the laws of warfare, saved countless American lives at a crucial juncture in one of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles. It demonstrated how individual initiative and unconventional thinking could make a decisive difference even amid the mechanized mass destruction of modern warfare. Today, a small display at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, commemorates Goodson's improvised deception. Next to a preserved SCR-300 radio cites a simple placard that reads, "Sometimes victory comes not from what is said, but from who appears to be saying it." For the men of the 5th Marine Division who survived that night on Iwo Jima, the unknown voice on a wire recorder represented the difference between life and death, a 30-second message that altered the course of one of World War II's most consequential battles. The legacy of Private First Class Goodson's action extends beyond the immediate lives saved. It became a case study in military communications security, leading to enhanced encryption and authentication protocols for battlefield communications. The vulnerability he exploited, the difficulty in verifying the source of orders in combat conditions, led to significant improvements in how military forces around the world secure their command networks. Perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us that in warfare's chaos, individual courage and creativity remain decisive factors, even in an age of mass armies and industrial-scale destruction. The battle for Iwo Jima, remembered for its iconic flag-raising and staggering casualty figures, was shaped by countless individual decisions and acts of initiative that never made headlines but collectively determined its outcome. Decades later, when asked about his actions that night, Goodson characteristically downplayed his role. "I just applied what I knew about radio systems to the problem at hand," he said. "Any of the other radio men would have done the same if they'd thought of it. I was just the right person in the right place at the right time." Such modesty was common among the World War II generation, who often viewed their extraordinary actions as simply doing what was necessary under the circumstances. Yet Goodson's 30 seconds of unconventional thinking exemplifies how individual initiative can change history even amid the anonymous destruction of modern warfare. The black sands of Iwo Jima, once soaked with the blood of both American and Japanese fighters, now stand as a quiet memorial to one of history's most intense battles. Visitors today can still see the remnants of bunkers and tunnel systems that made the island such a formidable objective. What they cannot see are the invisible radio waves that once carried a deceptive message, briefly creating the confusion that helped save 10,000 American lives. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.